Enter a realm where enigmas, buried terrors, and otherworldly conflicts spring to life. If you're captivated by the hidden facets of folklore, please give this video a thumbs up, follow our channel, and hit the notification bell to ensure you catch every epic tale. Music. Morning's faint glow left me weary, twisted in my bedding. After a restless night of fragmented dreams, I stirred with hazy memories of distant hoofbeats and a shadowy, headless figure lurking just out of reach, specters that vanished with the sunrise. Unnerved yet resolute to dispel baseless dread, I decided to uncover more about my father's final moments. Perhaps the townspeople could illuminate his mental state or assist with the practicalities of his funeral and inheritance. That late morning, I wandered into the core of Sleepy Hollow. It was a quaint village, a cluster of farmhouses and time-worn homes, a simple inn at the crossroad, and the white spire of the old Dutch church rising above trees ablaze with autumn hues. Locals regarded me with curiosity. Some vaguely recalled me as Thomas Vanton's son, now back under tragic circumstances. A few extended quiet sympathies. I expressed gratitude and subtly guided the talk toward my father's behavior before his passing. Over a mug of ale at the inn, I gathered uneasy whispers about his last days. Neighbors remarked that he had become gaunt and anxious, roaming the cemetery at strange hours, as though seeking to placate a ghost. Some murmured that he admitted a fear of the headless horseman. One loudmouth scoffed, dismissing the specter as mere myth. He bragged about once posing as the horseman to frighten a teacher long ago. Yet others spoke softly of mysterious hoofbeats in the dead of night and a headless rider glimpsed amid the trees. Real or not, the tale clearly tormented my father. He was found lifeless on the path by the church, they said, his face etched with horror. The revelation gripped my soul. If fear alone hadn't broken him, what unspeakable terror had he faced that night? I departed the inn lost in somber thought. Twilight was descending over Sleepy Hollow, shadows lengthening across the path as I headed toward the churchyard. I felt drawn to see my father's new grave before returning home, despite the growing cold and my troubled heart. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when I arrived at the old Dutch church. The nearby graveyard rested in faint stillness. Weathered tombstones leaned unevenly beneath twisted trees. Fallen leaves rustled like hushed cautions under my steps as I wove through the plots. I located my father's burial site near the western boundary, marked by a plain wooden cross set in the fresh heap of soil. Kneeling, I whispered a prayer for his peace. The evening air was eerily calm. Even the crickets had gone quiet. As I stood to leave, my gaze fell on a patch of earth nearby, oddly devoid of any headstone. A rough, rectangular plot lay there, older than my father's but neglected and nameless among the tidy markers. A memory flickered from the inn's gossip, the unmarked grave of the Hessian soldier, said to be haunted by the headless horseman. I realized I must be standing by that unknown warrior's resting place. A sudden breeze moaned through the oak limbs above. The last leaves rattled faintly, and in that fleeting moment, between dusk and dark, the light waned. Deep shadows crept among the graves. A primal urge to run tingled in my veins, as if hidden eyes watched from every shadowed corner between the stones. I hastened toward the path where I'd tied my horse, my heart starting to race without clear reason. Then I heard it, a distant clatter of hooves on the road, the same hollow thud growing closer as I stood rooted, my pulse roaring in my ears. Squinting into the twilight, I saw no rider on the path. Yet the hoofbeats intensified, steady but unyielding. My horse snorted and pawed restlessly, pulling at her reins as if detecting an unseen threat. A form took shape from the dimness beyond the church gate, a massive black steed, its eyes glowing like embers in the near dark. Mounted on it was a headless trooper in a ragged uniform. His broad frame sat unnaturally upright in the saddle, and above it, nothing. No head, only a jagged neck from which pale wisps of fog curled. I stood paralyzed, every fiber gripped by dread as the headless horseman halted scarcely 20 paces away. He uttered no sound now. Even his horse's steps fell strangely mute, as if the earlier din of pursuit had been a trick of my panicked mind. Though he lacked eyes, I sensed an invisible stare sizing me up, holding me fast. Then the steed snorted a plume of white vapor and stepped closer. That slight motion unleashed my fear. With a choked cry, I lunged for my horse. The phantom rider spurred his mount in pursuit, the sudden thunder of hooves tearing the ground behind me. In a frenzy, I scrambled into the saddle, nearly toppling my horse. She reared, mirroring my panic, then bolted at a wild gallop down the path. We sped toward the narrow wooden bridge by the stream fringed with willows, the same bridge folklore swore the horseman couldn't cross. I dared not glance back, though I felt the quake of each hoofbeat gaining. The bridge appeared ahead, its boards slippery with moss. My horse's hooves pounded across it in a blur. Just as we reached the far bank, a deafening crack shattered the night. Something heavy whizzed by my head and crashed into a tree ahead, bursting into fragments. I crouched low, clinging desperately. The horse galloped on until, past the bridge, I could coax her to slow. Trembling, I finally looked back. There, on the opposite side of the stream, at the bridge's edge, stood the headless horseman. Moonlight flashed on the edge of a lifted sword in his grip. He reined his charger in, unable or unwilling to cross the running water. Though I could discern no face, I somehow felt the cold fury emanating from that figure, a rage as palpable as heat from a fire. At his horse's feet lay the shattered fragment of a fallen tree limb he had hurled at me when I escaped his grasp. Had I not ducked, it might have dashed out my brains. We stared at each other across the brook for a breathless moment. Then the spectre lowered his blade. With a final snort of fury, he wheeled his steed around and vanished into the darkness, galloping back toward the churchyard from whence he came. I sagged in the saddle, drenched in cold sweat. Could I deny what I had witnessed? The horseman was no tale. He was real, and I had now met his awful gaze. My father's terror was suddenly illuminated. This was the horror he had faced. Whatever that headless revenant sought, I sensed it would not rest until its dreadful purpose was fulfilled, and that I had become entangled in its cursed quest. As I guided my trembling mare homeward through the darkness, a keen dread settled over me. In the rustle of the wind-tossed leaves, I almost imagined I heard my father's pleading whisper, "Forgive me." The nightmare, I knew, had only begun. Sunrise found me haggard and heartsick, yet alive. After the horrors of the previous night, I barricaded myself indoors at dawn and snatched a few hours of uneasy sleep in the light of day. My dreams were fractured recollections, my father's ashen face, a cannon's thunder, a headless soldier reaching out to me with accusing silence. I awoke before noon with resolve hardening within my chest. Somewhere in this house lay the secret that had bound my father to the headless horseman. I intended to unearth it, no matter how dreadful the truth. I began my search in my father's study. Throwing open the shutters to let in the daylight, I ransacked the roll-top desk where he kept his personal papers. Stacks of correspondence and receipts spilled out, but nothing of obvious relevance. Next, I scoured the shelves, thumbing through books for hidden notes. Dust speckled the air, tickling my throat. My frustration mounted as each drawer and cupboard yielded only mundane artifacts of a life now extinguished. I felt the minutes slipping away, twilight would come all too soon. Just as despair began to set in, I noticed a sheet of paper half hidden behind a ledger on the desk. To my astonishment, it bore my name in my father's bold script. The ink looked fresh. It was an unsealed letter addressed to me in his hand. With trembling fingers, I began to read. My dear son, if you find this letter, it means I have failed in my last endeavor. I pray you understand what I could not bring myself to speak aloud. For years, I have lived under a shadow of guilt and dread. In the Revolutionary War, I played a part in a tragedy, one I have tried to set right, but fear may now set upon me before I succeed. I write of the Hessian trooper, whose restless ghost is said to wander Sleepy Hollow. He is no mere fable to frighten children. I know this spectre all too well. I was present when he met his fate. I loaded the very cannon that shattered his skull. I watched him fall, the headless trunk of his body swaying in the saddle before toppling. I have never forgotten that sight. After the war, I learned of his act of heroism, saving young Sarah Vanisel from a burning house that same day. Haunted by remorse, I helped ensure his body was buried on holy ground. Yet something vital remained undone. In truth, I recovered what became of his severed head some years later, a fragment of skull unearthed by rain and time near the old battlefield. I kept this grisly relic, intending to lay it with his remains, but cowardice and fear of the uncanny stayed my hand. These past months, the horseman's presence has grown stronger. I hear hoofbeats at night outside my door. I feel him watching from dark corners. He knows I have what he seeks. On All Hallows' Eve, I shall try at last to do what I must, return his skull to its grave and beg his pardon. My heart falters to think of it, but I can delay no longer. If I fail, should my courage or strength give out, please, my son, do what I could not. Take the skull from its hiding place in the attic chest and reunite it with his bones in the churchyard. Speak a prayer for the fallen, whose only sin was loyalty to his own cause. In this way, perhaps you may redeem us both from this haunting fate. I am forever proud of you. May God forgive me for leaving you this burden. Your loving father, Thomas Vanton. By the time I finished reading, tears were flowing freely down my cheeks. My father's burden was now unmistakably mine. He had stood on the brink of making amends, only for death to take him first, perhaps with the horseman's spectral hand at his back. I folded the letter to my heart, chest tight with sorrow and resolve. The attic chest mentioned in his letter beckoned. In a dusty corner of the garret, under a moth-eaten tarp, I found the sturdy oak chest, locked, but the key conveniently taped to its underside. Within lay a bundle wrapped in cloth. I hesitated, then gently unveiled it. Empty eye sockets stared back at me from a weathered skull, the bone fissured by a jagged crack. I bit back a cry as I realized I was holding the very object of the horseman's desire, his long-lost head, or what remained of it. For a long moment, I knelt in the motes of attic light, cradling that skull as one might hold a frightened child. All fear of its ghastliness had melted into a profound melancholy. This skull had once housed the dreams and agonies of a living man, a man who showed kindness in a cruel war, only to meet a brutal end and decades of restless wandering. That wandering would continue no more if I had any say. I swore then to carry out my father's last wish. Tonight, I would return the skull to the Hessian's grave and lay this vengeful phantom to rest. My stomach fluttered with fear at the prospect of facing the horseman again. But a spark of defiant courage flared within me. I would not be alone. My Father's Spirit would guide my hand, and justice, though long delayed, would light my path. As the sun crept low and the autumn light began to fail, I prepared myself for the coming darkness, steeling my soul with purpose. In that dim attic, with memory and duty pressed upon me, I whispered into the silence, "This ends tonight." Night fell, moonless and sepulchral, as I ventured forth with the Hessian skull secured in a satchel under my arm. A hard frost silvered the ground and turned my every breath into ghostly vapor. My heart drummed against my ribs, but I pressed on toward the old Dutch church. There, in that hallowed ground, the headless soldier awaited the justice or vengeance due him. Unseen eyes seemed to watch from every shadow. The gnarled trees loomed as silent sentinels, and even the wind whispered warnings. Yet I did not falter. I carried with me a lantern, a spade, and my father's old flintlock pistol. Not that I expected a firearm to avail me against a specter, but clutching it gave me a morsel of courage. In the satchel, I bore the skull, padded with cloth. Several times, I thought I heard the clop of a hoof behind me, only to spin and find nothing but swaying shadows. Whether the horsemen stalked me already or my nerves conjured phantoms of their own, I could not tell. I whispered a prayer as I walked, for my own soul, for my father's, and even for the restless dead man I sought to lay to rest. When I reached the churchyard, the old wooden gate gave a long groan. I slipped inside the burial ground, my lantern held high. The familiar headstones and leaning crosses were at once reassuring and eerie beneath the starless sky. The place was utterly silent, except for the sighing of the breeze through bare branches. I navigated to the far corner by memory and weak light until my boot struck a small, rough stone half-sunken in weeds. Here, this unmarked patch was the Hessian's grave. Setting the lantern down, I drew a deep breath of the icy air. My hands shook, not from the chill, but from the gravity of what I was about to do. With effort, I steadied myself and began to dig. The earth was hardened by frost, but my determination was a sharper spade. Clouds of frozen soil yielded slowly. Each thrust of metal into the ground rang out in the still night. I worked until the shallow outline of a pit took shape, sweat beading on my brow despite the cold. Kneeling, I gently lifted the skull from its wrappings and held it in the lantern's glow. Empty sockets stared back as if awaiting judgment. "Soon you will rest," I murmured, my breath billowing. My eyes burned with a strange mix of dread and compassion. No sooner had I lowered the skull toward the earth than the night erupted with a fearsome snarl of wind. The lantern flame guttered violently. From behind me came the sound I had been bracing for, the distinct clop of heavy hooves approaching. Each iron-shod step was deliberate, echoing among the tombstones. I rose to my feet, spinning around with the skull in one hand and the pistol in the other. Out of the darkness, at the edge of the lantern's glow, the headless horseman emerged like an incarnate curse. His steed's eyes burned with that same unearthly crimson light I'd seen before. The rider's headless form loomed taller than any mortal man in the saddle, saber already drawn and gleaming. He had come, as I knew he would, drawn inexorably to the token of his lost self. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. I could sense raw hatred pouring off the phantom in waves, but also something else, an agony of longing that clung to him as tangibly as the tatters of his old uniform. My knees threatened to buckle under the weight of his presence, yet I forced myself to stand firm. I had come to face him, not to flee. Swallowing hard, I lifted my chin and called out into the gloom, "I know who you are. I carry no weapon against you, but the truth." My voice sounded small in the vast night. "You saved an innocent child and were repaid with death. You were left nameless in a foreign grave. But I know of your valor. I have your head here, sir, ready to return it to your grave." The horseman reined in a few yards away, his sword arm, which had been raised to strike, seeming to hesitate. The faceless stump craned forward as if he were trying to see the object cradled in my arm. In that moment, I felt a pang of pity amid my fear. This lost soul yearned for what I held. Slowly, I crouched and set the skull atop the disturbed earth by the open grave. "Here is your rest waiting," I said softly. "Take it and let this vengeance cease. You have suffered enough." For an instant, the phantom was still, and a fragile hope stirred within me. Then a livid crimson glow ignited in the hollow of his neck. With a voiceless howl of fury, he whirled his sword and spurred his steed forward. I raised my pistol and fired reflexively. The shot cracked the night, but the horseman did not waver. In the next heartbeat, he was upon me. I threw myself aside with a desperate cry as his saber scythed through the air, grazing my shoulder. I hit the ground hard among the graves, pain jolting through my side. Dazed, I staggered up as the horseman wheeled around for another charge. My lantern lay toppled and dark, leaving only starlight and the faint glow from his severed neck to see by. My fingers closed around the fallen spade. I snatched it up and braced myself just as the spectre bore down once more. His saber slammed into the shovel's iron blade with a burst of sparks, jolting my arms to the bone. I sank to one knee under the inhuman force of the blow, barely holding on. The horseman rained further blows, each strike driving me closer to the ground. My muscles trembled under the unearthly onslaught. "Please, I'm trying to help you," I cried out, my voice raw with desperation. The only answer was the scrape of steel grinding nearer to my throat. Just then, a deep gong reverberated across the night, the church bell tolling midnight. The spectre visibly shuddered at the first stroke. With each resonant peal, he seemed to falter, as if the sound seized his very spirit. At the 12th and final chime, the horseman recoiled, his sword arm wavering for the briefest moment. Sensing a fleeting chance, I tore myself free from under the pressing blade. Above me, the headless horseman reared for the final blow. With a last surge of will, I hurled myself toward the open grave, thrusting the skull toward its rightful rest, just as the spectral saber cleaved the darkness over my head. Music. The horseman's blade hissed through the air and bit into the earth with an impact that jarred the ground. I had flung myself headlong into the open grave, clutching the skull to my chest. Dirt and pebbles rained upon my back from the force of that aborted death blow. My mind reeled that I was somehow still alive. Above me, I heard the horseman wrench his sword free of the soil with a terrible grinding scrape. This reprieve would last only an instant. With shaking hands, I pushed myself up from the shallow pit and did the only thing left that might end this nightmare. I set the Hessian's skull into his grave. At that sight, the headless horseman halted. In the pale starlight, I saw him slowly dismount, boots hitting the ground without a sound. He advanced to the grave's edge and stood over me. I knelt there, chest heaving, one hand still resting on the skull that now lay upon the cold earth. My breath plumed in the dark as I gazed up at the looming spectre. For a heartbeat, I feared he would strike me down regardless, but he did not. Instead, the horseman dropped to one knee opposite me, his empty hands reaching toward the skull like a penitent at an altar. Gently, almost reverently, the phantom lifted the skull. His movements were slow, no longer violent or wrathful. I could only watch, awestruck and trembling, as he raised that bone fragment toward the stump of his neck. The skull settled into place with uncanny ease. A faint glow shimmered along the jagged seam where death had sundered head from body. Then, before my widening eyes, the head knit itself to the ghostly flesh. In an instant, the Hessian stood before me, not as a grotesque spectre, but as a whole man. His face was young, broad, and solemn. His eyes, which moments ago blazed with hellish light, now looked clear and far away. He removed a battered helmet from his head and got slowly to his feet. I rose unsteadily as well, my heart pounding. We stood face to face at the brink of his resting place, a living man and an unliving soul. The Hessian's countenance was stern, but no longer twisted by fury. For the first time, I could see him truly, a weary soldier far from home. The wind stirred the black hair at his temples and fluttered the rags of his uniform. There was a long pause as he regarded me in silence. At last, I found my voice in halting German remembered from childhood prayers. I whispered, Ruhe in Frieden. Rest in peace. My words hung in the cold air. The Hessian's hard-set mouth softened slightly. He raised his gloved hand to his brow in a slow, deliberate salute. I returned the gesture with a shaking hand, tears brimming in my eyes. In that salute, I felt the gratitude of a soul released from a long torment. The horseman, no, the soldier, lowered his arm. He glanced once more to me, then down to the yawning grave that had awaited him all these years. With a final nod, he stepped backward into the shadows, enfolding his burial plot. A gentle breeze swept through the graveyard, carrying a sigh of relief. When I blinked, the Hessian was gone. All that remained was a faint shimmer in the air and the sense that an immense weight had been lifted. His horse, too, had vanished like a wisp of mist. A sudden stillness fell over the churchyard. The curse of the headless horseman had been laid to rest at last. I released a trembling breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My legs gave out, and I sank to the ground by the lantern's overturned frame. The night sky was paling to a chilly pre-dawn gray in the east. In the looming silence, I found myself weeping out of relief, exhaustion, and a bittersweet sorrow. My father's quest was fulfilled, but at the cost of his life and nearly my own. Yet it had not been in vain. With the first weak light of dawn, I climbed out of the grave and pressed the fresh earth down, burying the skull with its kin. I offered a final prayer for the fallen, for the Hessian, for my father, and for all restless souls still wandering. Sunrise found me still in the churchyard, weary but at peace. A chorus of sparrows erupted from the nearby trees as dawn's golden light spilled over the horizon, touching the frosted grass with warmth. The old Dutch church's weathered walls glowed softly in that morning radiance, as if the valley itself were relieved of a great burden. Sleepy Hollow was awakening to a new day, and for the first time in a generation, it did so unhaunted. I gathered my scattered belongings, the spent pistol, the mud-caked spade, and quietly made my way home. Though bone-tired, I felt an unexpected lightness in my step. The gloom that had hung over my heart and over this land seemed to have lifted. My sleep that day was deep and untroubled by dreams. When I awoke at dusk, I found myself standing at my window, gazing toward the direction of the churchyard. The night was clear and still. For the first time in memory, I felt no dread of the darkness. Where once I would strain to catch the echo of ghostly hooves, now there was only the chorus of crickets and the gentle murmur of the breeze. The following morning, I returned to the grave by daylight. In the kindly warmth of the sun, I knelt and placed a simple wooden cross at the head of the Hessian's resting place. I had carved into it a short epitaph, "Here lies a faithful soldier. May he rest in peace." There was no name to add. His true name was known only to God, but I felt that these words and the honor behind them were enough. As I stood to leave, I noticed old Mrs. Vanisel watching from afar. Her aging face creased in a thoughtful frown. She had long tended this ground out of gratitude, and now she gave me a slow, understanding nod. Wordless, we both knew that the shadow which had lain on Sleepy Hollow was finally dispelled. In the weeks that followed, life in the valley returned to its quiet rhythm. The tale of the Headless Horseman became just that, a tale retold by firesides as a piece of bygone lore. Some villagers remarked on how the strange nighttime noises ceased abruptly, but most simply carried on, content that an eerie chapter had closed. I did not volunteer the truth of what transpired. Some truths, I think, live best in the privacy of one's heart. Yet I took solace in knowing that my father's spirit could rest easy now, absolved of the guilt he had carried. I felt his presence often in those early days of winter, no longer as a tormented murmur in the night, but as a gentle encouragement in my soul to move forward. Before departing Sleepy Hollow to resume my own life, I paid a final visit to the old Dutch church. A light snow had since fallen, blanketing the graves in a white hush. I found the Hessian's grave marked by my cross, a pure mantle of snow upon it. I stood there for a long moment in reverent silence. Requiem aeternam dona eis, Domini, I whispered, the Latin prayer for eternal rest. The air was still and clear. As I turned to go, a lone crow called and took flight from the church steeple, disappearing into the bright winter sky. I allowed myself a small smile. The legends and restless ghosts of Sleepy Hollow would linger in story and memory, but I knew in my heart that the fear which once gripped this place had been laid to rest, and justice, tempered with mercy, had finally been done.